Movie jail is where all the directors that had once promising careers end up when they make the one mistake movie studios hate the most: lose money. It's the one place no director wants to end up in, but as budgets get wildly expensive and fewer movies get made, it's more likely that that's where directors will inevitably end up. It's even claimed some of the brightest stars of Hollywood derailing their careers for years, if not forever. When Damien Chazelle arrived on the scene, he was something of a Hollywood wunderkind. Here was a guy not even 30 yet, and he had already directed Whiplash, considered to be one of the best movies of the 21st century so far. Even better, the movie was a surprising commercial success, making $49 million on a tiny $3.3 million budget. Then, just 2 years later, he made history with 2016's La La Land. The musical made $447 million on a $30 million budget and, similar to Whiplash, is also considered one of the best movies of the 21st century. More important for Chazelle though, it made him, at 32, the youngest director to win the Academy Award for Best Director. For context, the previous record was set by Norman Taurog for 1931's Skippy when he was also 32. In his early 30s, Chazelle had 2 critical and commercial successes on his hand and was the next big thing. Then it all started to go wrong. Very, very wrong. First came 2018's First Man, a biopic about Neil Armstrong. The movie had great reviews and is a good movie about an interesting stoic man, but it did not succeed at the box office. Okay, so one movie that underperformed, not a big deal. But what was a big deal was that his next movie was not only the most expensive movie that he'd done, but an unqualified box office disaster. This was 2022's Babylon, an epic about Hollywood's transition from silent films to talkies in the late 1920s. Babylon had a lot of things going against it. For one, it was a very polarizing movie. For two, it was a very long movie at 3 hours and 9 minutes. Theaters don't like 3-hour plus long movies because they end up taking valuable screen real estate for long periods of time, and they especially don't like it when the movie that Babylon was trying to compete with was James Cameron's Avatar: The Way of Water, the now 3rd highest grossing movie of all time, and perhaps the most anticipated movie of 2022. Sure, it featured Margot Robbie, but this was pre-Barbie, and Robbie was just coming off another movie bomb, Amsterdam, directed by David O. Russell. It did not stand a chance against the juggernaut that was Avatar: The Way of Water. So you won't be surprised to learn that it collapsed under its own weight, pulling in a rough $63.4 million on a budget of as much as $80 million. Movies need to make at least 2.5 times their budget to break even, so Babylon would have needed to make $200 million to break even. That didn't happen. Babylon wasn't the only casualty though. Damien Chazelle's bright star dimmed alongside the movie. He landed in what we call movie jail, the place where those that commit the cardinal sin, losing a bunch of money for a movie studio, go in order to reflect on their mistakes and build up their trust so they can get another large budget again. Of course, the executives that greenlight these movies don't go to movie jail as often, but that's for another video. Rather, in this video, I want to look at 3 main things. The first is how directors end up landing in movie jail. The second is other directors that have been or are in the same position as Chazelle and what happened to them, including if and how they got out. And the third is how Hollywood can change to ensure things like this don't happen, because they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot, and those changes will need to happen on both sides of the aisle. Movie jail is not a difficult concept to grasp. It basically means that if you lose the studio's money on a film, that film might be the last one that you do, either forever or for a long, long time. If you're lucky enough to continue making movies, your budget will be a lot smaller, you'll be on a much tighter leash, and producers will probably be keeping tabs on every penny. The more interesting question is why it exists at all and the impact it can have on a director's career and person. As movies have gotten more expensive and as fewer of them are being made, coupled with the pandemic and the recent strikes, film creatives are standing on a knife's edge. If they lean too much to one side and fall off that edge, they could very quickly find themselves out of a job. A movie doesn't even have to bomb. Underperformance might be enough to land you in hot water with studios. Part of the reason movie jail exists at all is because of the overall business landscape. Most major studios at this point, such as Paramount, which produced Babylon, are either public companies themselves or part of public companies. That means they have investors and Wall Street breathing down their necks about showing improvements on a quarter-over-quarter basis. When a movie bombs or underperforms, you should think of it as an investment underperforming or, worse, getting wiped out. Hollywood has always had a push-pull relationship between the creative side and the business side, and it's shifted over the decades. The late 60s to 70s were the auteur-driven era where the director was the star of the film. But a bomb by Michael Cimino, one of the directors we'll be talking about in a minute, led to the end of that era and the ascent of the studio. The 80s leaned more to the business side, which makes sense as blockbusters were a new thing. Star Wars had shown that toys and merchandise were billion-dollar businesses, and there was an overall period of consolidation ushered in by the deregulation prompted by Ronald Reagan. The 90s shifted yet again. The creatives had more power thanks to movies being cheaper to make and more revenue streams such as home distribution. There's a reason that the 90s were a decade of independent cinema. Then we got into the 2000s. The internet would turn everyone into a critic, so movies had to walk a tightrope. That also meant that they became more homogenized. Studios would take fewer risks and find comfort in nostalgia-driven sequels, remakes, and reboots, some of which were successful, many of which were not. The rise of streaming made them more reliant on safe bets that were sure to be hits with audiences, most notably with the MCU, which dominated most of the 2010s. In fact, of the top 50 highest-grossing films of the 2010s, only a few were original. One issue with this environment of safety was that creative risk is not only looked down on, but can actively end careers. In February of 2024, Chazelle was on the Talking Pictures podcast and was not only cognizant of, but reflective on his career after Babylon. In his words, quote, "I have no illusions. I won't get a budget of Babylon size anytime soon, or at least not on this next one," end quote. The fact that he did get a next one at all is a miracle unto itself, though considering his overall track record, it should be warranted. Chazelle is a great director and has a lot left in him. But the boondoggle that was Babylon left something of a mental scar on Damien Chazelle. He had mentioned being in a, quote, trepidatious sort of mind, end quote, and that he, quote, learned the hard way that there will be some fundamental part of me that's anxious no matter what, whether the previous one worked or didn't, end quote. Some people have a notion that once you get knocked down, you'll get back up like nothing happened at all. In real life, that's not how it works. After you've been knocked down, part of that will stay with you, and you will, understandably, become nervous. That's what happened to Chazelle, who also said that while you try not to let it get to you, you can't help but let it get to you. The pressure is further increased by the contractions in the industry, which might be the biggest contributing factor. That is, there are fewer movies being made, both big budget and mid budget. The latter is an especially painful loss because, traditionally, it served as a training ground and proving ground for directors. You would usually make an indie film, and if it found success, you would get a slightly higher budget and make a mid-budget film, and if that found success, you would get a shot at a big-budget film. Chad Stahelski, Damien Chazelle, Greta Gerwig, and Ryan Coogler all followed this path to varying degrees. But the feature landscape has moved almost entirely toward intellectual property-driven features, and those often come with producers that micromanage these movies. The biggest offender is probably Marvel, and others have done great videos on the homogeneity in Marvel movies. You need not look further than how the movie is marketed. It's always Marvel Studios presents so-and-so, and not Ryan Coogler presents Black Panther or Jon Favreau presents Iron Man. The studio, that is the franchise, the intellectual property, replaced the movie star and the director as the star for most of the last decade and a half of movies. Studios are also getting more stringent with their purse strings and who they hire for a job. Mia Gallupo, writing for The Hollywood Reporter, wrote a piece about the state of director hiring in the industry. She noted that non-writing directors, or directors for hire that direct movies that other people have written, are having a harder time getting jobs, and that directors that come up in the festival circuit with a few movies are also finding it difficult to break in. In her words, quote, "New talent must deliver multiple successful projects in a row, sans slip-ups, before being afforded the grace, albeit only so much, to fill at the studio level," end quote. The studio, of course, has its own needs. It needs people that can deliver movies, quote, on time, on budget, and on brand, end quote. Basically, they need more Ridley Scotts and fewer Stanley Kubricks. Granted, Scott had a recent failure in Napoleon, but he built a multi-decade reputation for making movies that were often finished on or before time and on or under budget. Kubrick, meanwhile, would take all the time and money he wanted to make a movie, but no one would question it because it was Stanley Kubrick, and you gave the man whatever time and budget he damn well pleased. Right now, studios prefer the Scott model. The outlook isn't much different or better on the streaming side. There, unless you're already a well-known theatrical director like David Fincher, Zack Snyder, Rian Johnson, or Martin Scorsese, you're unlikely to see a boost in prospects from streaming. I was thinking about all the movies I had seen on Netflix, Apple TV+, Amazon Prime, and elsewhere, and it hit me that I don't really know any of the directors that make these direct-to-streaming movies. I know the brand, Netflix, Apple TV, etc., but that's it. I don't know who directed 365 Days or its sequel, and I don't know who directed the Kissing Booth movies. It's telling that the most successful Netflix originals are all by directors that already made their bones in the industry. There aren't any homegrown successes. In Mia Galoppo's article on Director Jail, one of the people that she asked questions of was even more blunt, saying, quote, "No one cares if your movie did well on streaming," end quote. It makes sense in a way. Film is a cutthroat industry full of ambitious people, and theatrical is still the way to make one's name in the industry. Over the decades, several other directors found themselves in the exact same position as Damien Chazelle. It's actually kind of wild how similar their stories are. They were, often, young men who arrived on the scene with either a critical or financial bang. Their first or second features did very well, and they were able to earn more creative and financial freedom from the studios. But, often, this creative and financial freedom would end up being their downfall. They took massive liberties, sometimes taking a couple of miles when they were just given an inch, often to disastrous results. Some of them would get other chances, but for many, their stories were effectively over. Perhaps the most famous case of movie jail happened with Michael Cimino. His first movie, Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, was a solid critical and commercial success based on its $4 million budget, but it was his next movie, The Deer Hunter, that really took Hollywood by storm. Considered one of the best movies ever made, the film won critical acclaim, was a modest box office success, and won 5 of the 9 Academy Awards it was nominated for, including Best Picture and Best Director. So, for his next movie, Cimino got a massive budget for the time and full creative control. He was given an inch and decided he would take as many miles as he could, and he did just that. Heaven's Gate was a disastrous bomb, grossing just $3.5 million on its insane $44 million budget. It was called one of the worst movies ever made and, according to some, contributed to the fall of United Artists and put creative control back in the hands of the studios, who didn't want another instance like it ever again. Cimino let the success of The Deer Hunter get to his head, and it screwed him in the end. The original budget was much more modest, around $11 million, but the costs just kept going up and up. Now granted, that happens from time to time. Seven Samurai, directed by Akira Kurosawa, also had costs go up and up, but Michael Cimino was no Akira Kurosawa. He was something of a dictator on set and was obsessive to the point of ridiculousness with some of his shots. The most amusing story is that he once held up production so a particular cloud was in frame before rolling the cameras. Cimino's next movie was Year of the Dragon, another flop that came 5 years after Heaven's Gate. None of his movies after The Deer Hunter would do well, and his last movie was 1996's The Sun Chaser, which made $21,508 on a budget of $31 million. It was the last movie that he would ever do. M. Night Shyamalan is another example, though he eventually worked his way out of movie jail. He was hailed as the next Spielberg around the time that The Sixth Sense came out, and it's easy to see why. Like Chazelle, Shyamalan had a massive hit at 29, and his next several movies, Unbreakable, Signs, and The Village, were similar successes. He took a bit of a dip with Lady in the Water, but was back on top with The Happening. But then came the 2 missteps that would derail his career, The Last Airbender and After Earth. The Last Airbender was critically panned, but still managed to double its budget, so he got another chance. But After Earth was not just critically panned, but failed to even double its budget, meaning it probably lost money. Considering the outsized impact of Rotten Tomatoes, and considering both of these movies' lackluster scores, Shyamalan was relegated to movie jail. He couldn't get a budget for any more movies, so in order to get himself out of movie jail, he had to risk it all. Admirably, Shyamalan took out a loan against his house and self-funded his next movie, 2015's The Visit. Made on a budget of $5 million, the movie made almost $100 million at the box office. 2016's Split was similar, a self-funded venture to the tune of $9 million, which made close to $279 million at the box office. When he was sent to Movie Joe, Shyamalan didn't depend on the studios to bring him back. He decided to turn away from big-budget boondoggles and return to his roots. Weird, small movies that could have an outsized return at the box office. He broke out of Movie Joe by himself and, in that regard, is one of the few to do so. Josh Trank, however, is on the other, far more depressing side of the spectrum. The saddest thing about Trank is that there's not much to say because he wasn't able to do much before his career collapsed, in part thanks to one movie. He arrived on the scene at the tender age of 28, with 2012's Chronicle, a $15 million superhero movie that made a solid $127 million at the box office and got good reviews. But suddenly, producer 20th Century Fox, for some reason, decided to take a massive risk on Trank, giving him the reins to 2015's Fantastic Four. Trank jumped from a modest $15 million budget to a $120 million budget that swelled to $155 million. One would assume that with great power would also come great responsibility, but that was not the case for Trank. Fantastic Four's production was a mess. Trank and his producers at Fox butted heads, which led to Fox changing the film without Trank's permission. While it's likely we'll never know the true story of what happened, one thing is clear. At a certain point, Trank was removed as a director in all but name and would later go on to disavow the film entirely, saying that his version is not the version that we see. And whether or not reports of his erratic behavior were true or not, it led to lost opportunities. Trank was selected to helm a standalone Boba Fett movie, but after the reports about the disastrous production of Fantastic Four, he was fired from that role. His most recent movie was 2020's Capone, a movie about Al Capone whose release, unfortunately, coincided with the height of the pandemic. It wasn't able to perform at the box office and did not perform well with critics either. He's still a young guy, so I'm hoping that he's able to make a comeback. Chronicle was an interesting film, and he has a biopic about Theodore Roosevelt in development. Alas, there's been nothing for 4 years, which might as well be forever in Hollywood. Patty Jenkins has had, arguably, the most undeserved stint in Movie Joe. She was just 32 when she came out with Monster, a wildly successful movie about serial killer alien war-notes that starred Charlize Theron. It had a tiny budget of $1.5 million and made $64.2 million at the box office, was a critical success, and even won Theron an Academy Award. But then, for whatever reason, nothing. No movie for 14 years despite attempts to get one made, and, I'd say, more than enough skill to deliver the goods. She would work in TV for that time until, finally, she was able to helm Wonder Woman, one of the few DC movies that actually made money. Wonder Woman was a critical and commercial success. Wonder Woman 1984, unfortunately, had its release pushed back multiple times and had a simultaneous release on HBO Max, which negatively impacted its box office prospects. Jenkins, however, served her undeserved time in Movie Joe and doesn't seem likely to go back anytime soon. Some directors end up in Movie Joe because they are, for lack of a better word, disturbing. There's Bryan Singer, who made movies like The Usual Suspects, the X-Men movies, and Bohemian Rhapsody, but hasn't had a project since 2019's Dark Phoenix, a critical and commercial flop whose release coincided with sexual abuse allegations. The same with Brett Ratner, who directed the Rush Hour trilogy and 2014's Hercules, but stopped producing movies around 2017 because of, again, sexual assault allegations. John McTiernan, who directed perennial action favorites such as Predator and Die Hard, didn't so much go to movie jail as he did actual jail. After being one of the most in-demand directors of the late 80s and 90s, he hired a private investigator, Anthony Policano, to illegally wiretap the phones of 2 people, then perjured himself about it and spent a year in prison. His last movie was 2003's Basic, after which his star pretty much imploded. Now, getting out of Movie Joe is obviously a lot harder than getting in. M. Night Shyamalan, Patty Jenkins, and Damien Chazelle really represent the 3 ways of doing it. M. Night Shyamalan's route is the simplest but also the riskiest. Instead of relying on studios to provide the money necessary, he provided it himself. He took a risk and it paid off, but it just as easily could have failed. His name had been dragged through the mud by the time of The Visit, and I'm sure he was as surprised as anyone when the movie ended up being a success. Eventually, after several more years and several more self-funded theatrical successes, he was able to land a successful show on Apple TV Plus, and he reliably puts out a movie every 2 or so years. Patty Jenkins, after her first feature success, tried to get others made, but all of those deals would fall through. So she went the TV route and made a name for herself there. Eventually, she was able to get onto a project that interested her and the studio, Warner Brothers, and got Wonder Woman done. Of course, that also took more than a decade to accomplish, so this isn't a quick route, and just as likely, nothing might come of it. Damien Chazelle's route is a bit more complicated. He's been able to rely on the successful past with only one notable failure, and that's Babylon. He still wants to make movies, so he'll likely have to make some concessions. The first is that for his next movie with Paramount Pictures, he'll direct, write, and produce at a smaller budget than what he had for Babylon. The second is that he'll probably have more oversight than he'd like from the studio. But it represents a chance to get back into the studios and audiences' good graces. Everyone loves a comeback story, and if there's one thing that Hollywood loves, it's nostalgia. His next movie is slated for release in 2025, almost a decade since his historic Academy Award win. If that's not a great comeback, I don't know what is. It's never been easier to end up in movie jail, and I think studios and creatives need to figure out a happy medium that works for both of them. Creatives need to understand that they must mix art with commerce. Otherwise, unless they're Stanley Kubrick or Paul Thomas Anderson or Yorgos Lanthimos, no one will want to give them the budget necessary to make a movie. Likewise, studios need to understand that a one strike and you're out model is not a tenable model. If they don't nurture talent, they'll be shooting themselves in the long run. If directors were only ever judged on their first movie, no one would be able to be a director since those movies almost always lose money. Studios need a more tenable track that guides directors from independent to big budget film, as was the case for Chad Stahelski, Greta Gerwig, Ryan Coogler, and Damien Chazelle. They all went from small budget movies to mid budget movies to big budget movies. The only difference between them is that Chazelle had something of a stumble with Babylon. He got a bit too ambitious and it backfired on him. But I think overall, studios need to be a bit more forgiving of missteps. Chazelle's had far more hits than misses after all. The sticking point is the budgets, which need to come down in general, as the current model seems unsustainable. Relying on brand name studios like Marvel or DC or Disney to drive hits is unreliable, as in the end, they're faceless and not personable. They're institutions, yes, but institutions can crumble. Film has always been about personalities, people you can get behind or root for. No one wants to root for a company, but they will root for Christopher Nolan or Greta Gerwig or Denis Villeneuve. Oppenheimer, Barbie, and Arrival each prove that one can make amazing, successful movies on budgets of $100 million or less, and that the nearly $400 million budget for something like Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny is unnecessary as well as unwarranted. Will movie jail ever fully go away? No, probably not. But I hope more people in it get the opportunity to get out and that the stints get shorter. Filmmakers like Chazelle are, in fact, not a dime a dozen, and in this era where even nostalgia-driven films like Indiana Jones or once Titanic franchises like the MCU are underperforming, we need more people like Damien Chazelle, not fewer.